Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI by David Gran. Vanishing. In April, millions of tiny flowers spread over the Blackjack Hills and vast prairies in the Osage Territory of Oklahoma. There are Johnny Jump-Ups and Spring Beauties and the Little Bluets. The Osage writer John Joseph Matthews said that the galaxy of petals makes it look as if the gods had left confetti. In May, when coyotes howl beneath the unnervingly large moon, taller plants such as spiderworts and black-eyed Susans begin to creep over the tinier blooms, stealing their light and water. The necks of the smaller flowers break and their petals flutter away, and before long they are buried underground. This is why the Osage Indians refer to May as the time of the flower-killing moon. On May 24th, 1921, Molly Burkhart, a resident of the Osage settlement town of Greyhorse, Oklahoma, began to fear that something might happen to one of her three sisters, Anna Brown. 34 and less than a year older than Molly, Anna had disappeared 3 days earlier. She had gone on sprees, as her family called them, dancing and drinking with friends until dawn. But this time, one night had passed and then another, and Anna had not shown up on Molly's front stoop as she usually did. When Anna came inside, she liked to slip off her shoes, and Molly missed the comforting sound of her moving and unhurried through the house. Instead, there was silence as still as the plains. Molly had already lost her sister Minnie 3 years earlier. Minnie's death had come with a shocking speed, and though doctors named it a peculiar wasting illness, Molly had her doubts. Minnie had been only 27 and had always been in perfect health. Like their parents, Molly and her sister had their names inscribed on the Osage roll, which meant they were among the registered members of the tribe. It also meant that they were worth a fortune. In the early 1870s, the Osage had been driven from their lands in Kansas onto a rocky, presumably worthless reservation in northeastern Oklahoma. Decades later, they discovered that this land was sitting above some of the largest oil deposits in the United States, and to get to that oil, prospectors had to pay the Osage. In the early 20th century, each person on the tribal roll began receiving a quarterly check. The amount was initially for only a few dollars, but over time, as more oil was tapped, the payments grew into hundreds and then thousands, and virtually every year they received more and more and more until tribe members had collectively accumulated millions and millions of dollars. In 1923 alone, the tribe took in more than 30 million, and which would be worth more than 400 million in today's terms. The Osage were considered the wealthiest people per capita in the world. Lo and behold, the New York Magazine Outlook exclaimed, the Indian, instead of starving to death, enjoys a steady income that turns bankers green with envy. The public had become transfixed by the tribe's prosperity, which contradicted many of the images of American Indians that could be traced back to the brutal first contact with whites, the original sin from which the country was born. Readers were fascinated by stories about the Osage brick masons the stories about the Osage brick mansions and chandeliers, their diamond rings and their fur coats and chauffeured cars. One writer marveled at Osage girls who attended the best boarding schools and wore sumptuous French clothing. At the same time, reporters seized upon any signs of the traditional Osage way of life, which seemed to stir in the public's mind visions of wild Indians. One article noted a circle of expensive automobiles surrounding an open campfire where the bronzed and brightly blanketed owners are cooking meat in the primitive style. Another documented a party of Osage arriving at the ceremony for the dances in a private airplane. Greyhorse was one of the reservation's oldest settlements. These outposts, including Fairfax, a larger town of nearly 1,500 people, and Pawhuska, the Osage capital, with a population of more than 6,000, seemed like fevered visions. The streets clamored with cowboys, fortune seekers, bootleggers, soothsayers, medicine men, outlaws, U.S. Marshals, New York financiers, and oil magnates. Automobiles sped among the paved horse trails, the smell of fuel overwhelming the scent of prairies. There were restaurants advertised as cafes, an opera house, and polo grounds. Although Molly didn't spend as lavishly as some of her neighbors did, she had built a beautiful, rambling wooden house in Greyhorse near her family's old lodge of lash poles, wooden mats, and bark. She owned several cars and had a staff of servants. The servants on the reservation were often called black or Mexican. In the early 1920s, the visitors to the reservation expressed contempt at the sight of even whites performing all the menial tasks about the house to which no Osage would stoop. Molly was one of the last people to see Anna before she vanished. That day, May 21st, Molly had risen close to dawn, a habit ingrained from which her father used to pray every morning to the sun. She was accustomed to the chorus of meadowlarks and sandpipers and prairie chickens, now overlaid with pocking of drills pounding the earth. Unlike many of her friends who shunned Osage clothing, Molly wrapped a traditional blanket around her shoulders. She also didn't cut her hair in the flapper bob, but let her long black hair flow over her back, revealing her striking face with its high cheekbones and big brown eyes. Her husband, Ernest Burkhart, rose with her. A 20-year-old white man, he looked like an extra in a Western picture show. Short brown hair, slate blue eyes, square chin. Only his nose disturbed the portrait. It looked as if it had taken a barroom punch or two. Growing up in Texas, the son of a poor cotton farmer, he had been enchanted by tales of the Osage Hills, the last American frontier where cowboys and Indians were said to still roam. In 1912, at 19, he packed a bag like Huck Finn, lighting out for the territory, and gone to live with his uncle, a domineering cattleman named William K. Hale in Fairfax. He was not the kind of man to ask you to do something he told you, Ernest once said of Hale, who became his surrogate father. The Ernest mostly ran errands for Hale. He sometimes worked as a taxi driver, which is how he met Molly, chauffeuring her around town. Ernest had a tendency to drink liquor and play stud poker with shady men. Beneath his roughness, though, there seemed to be a tenderness and a trace of insecurity about him, and Molly fell in love with him. Born a speaker of Osage, she had studied English in school, but Ernest still made the effort to learn her native language until he could talk with her in it. Molly suffered from diabetes, and he cared for her while her joints ached and her stomach burned with hunger. After he heard that another man had affections for her, he muttered that he couldn't live without her. It wasn't easy for them. It wasn't easy for them to marry. Ernest's roughneck friends ridiculed him for wanting to marry an Osage woman, and though Molly's three sisters had wed white men, she felt a responsibility to have an arranged Osage marriage the way her parents had. Still, Molly, whose family practiced a mixture of Osage and Catholic beliefs, couldn't understand why God would let her find love only then to take it away from her. So in 1917, she and Ernest exchanged rings, vows to love each other until eternity. By May of 1921, they had a daughter, Elizabeth, who was 2 years old, and a son, James, who was 8 months old and nicknamed Cowboy. Molly also tended to her aging mother, Lizzie, who had moved into the house after Molly's father passed away. Lizzie once feared that Molly would die young because of her diabetes, and she begged her other children to take care of her. In truth, Molly was the one who looked after all of them. May 21st was supposed to be the delightful day for Molly. She liked to entertain guests and was hosting a small luncheon. After getting dressed, she fed the children. Cowboy often had earaches, and she'd have to comfort him till he'd feel better. Then she issued instructions to her servants as everyone in the house bustled about except her mother, who'd fallen ill and stayed in bed. Molly asked Ernest to call Anna and see if she would come over to help tend Lizzie for a change. Anna, as the oldest child in the family, held a special status in her mother's eyes and was one of her as one and was the one their mother spoiled. When Ernest told Anna that her mama needed her, she promised to take a taxi straight there. She arrived shortly afterwards, dressed in bright red shoes, a skirt, a matching blanket. In her hand was an alligator purse. Before entering, she quickly combed her windblown hair and powdered her face. Molly noticed, however, that Anna was drunk. Molly couldn't hide her displeasure. Some of the guests had already arrived. Among them were two of Ernest's brothers, Brian and Horace Burkhart, who had been lured to Osage County by oil and had often assisted Hale on his ranch. One of Ernest's aunts, who spewed racist notions about American Indians, was also visiting, and the last thing Molly needed was for Anna to cause a commotion. Anna slipped off her shoes and began drinking whiskey. Molly knew that Anna had been very troubled as of late. She recently divorced her husband, a settler named Oda Brown, and since then she had spent more and more time in the reservation's boomtowns that sprung up to house and entertain oil workers. At Molly's house, Anna began to flirt with Ernest's younger brother Brian, who she sometimes dated. He was a more brooding than Ernest and had yellow flecked eyes and thinning hair, which he slicked back, a lawman who had described him as a troublemaker. When Brian asked one of the servants at the luncheon if she'd go to a dance with him that night, Anna said that if he fooled around with another woman, she'd kill him. Meanwhile, Ernest's aunt was muttering loud enough for all to hear how mortified she was that her nephew had married an American Indian. It was easy for Molly to suddenly strike back because one of the servants attending to the aunt was white, a blunt reminder of the town's social order. Anna continued causing a ruckus. She fought with the guests, fought with her mother, fought with Molly. She was drinking and quarreling, a servant later told authorities. I couldn't understand her language, but they were quarreling. The servant added, they had an awful time with Anna, and I was afraid. That evening, Molly planned to look after her mother while Ernest took the guest into Fairfax, 5 miles to the northwest, to meet his uncle Hale and see a play. Brian, who'd put on a cowboy hat, his cattle eyes peering out from under the brim, offered to drop Anna off at her house. Before they left, Molly washed Anna's clothes, gave her some food to eat, and made sure that she sobered up enough that Molly could glimpse Anna's unusual bright and charming self. They lingered together, making up and sharing a moment of calm. Then Anna said goodbye. A gold filling flashed through her smile. With every night that passed without her sister's return, Molly grew more and more anxious. Brian insisted that he had taken Anna straight home and dropped her off before heading to the play. After the third night, Molly, in her quiet but forceful way, pressured everyone into action. She sent Ernest to check on Anna's house. He jiggled the knob to her front door. It was locked. From the window, the rooms inside appeared dark and deserted. Page 12. Ernest stood there alone in the heat. A few days earlier, a cool rain had dusted the earth, and afterwards the sun's ray beat down mercifully through the blackjack trees. This time of year, heat blurred the prairies and made the tall grass creak underfoot. In the distance, through the shimmering light, he could see the skeletal frames of oil derricks. Anna's head servant, who lived next door, came outside, and Ernest asked her, "Do you know where Anna is?" The servant, she said, she stopped by Anna's house before the shower to close any open windows. I thought the rain would blow in, she explained, but she had seen that the door was locked and there was no sign of Anna. News of her absence spread through the boomtowns, traveling porch to porch, from store to store. Fueling the unease were reports that a 30-year-old Osage man, Charles Whitehorn, had vanished a week before Anna did. Friendly and funny, Whitehorn was married to a woman who was part white, part Cherokee. A local newspaper noted that he was popular among both whites and members of his own tribe. On May 14th, he left his home in the southwestern part of the reservation for Pawhuska. He never returned. Still, there was reason for Molly not to panic. It was possible that Anna slipped out after Brian had dropped her off and headed to Oklahoma City or across to the Kansas City. Perhaps she was dancing in one of those jazz clubs she liked to visit, unaware of the chaos she was trailing in her wake. And even if Anna had run into trouble, she knew how to protect herself. She often carried a small pistol in her alligator purse. She'd be back home soon, Ernest reassured Molly. A week after Anna disappeared, an oil worker was on a hill a mile north of downtown Pawhuska, when he noticed something poking out of the brush near the base of the derrick. The worker came closer. It was a body. The victim had been shot twice in the head. It was hot and wet and loud on the hillside. Drills shook the earth, and derricks swung their large, clawing arms back and forth. Other people gathered around the body, which was impossible to identify in its current condition. One of the pockets held a letter. Someone pulled it out and straightened out the paper and read it. The letter was addressed to Charles Whitehorn, and that's how they first knew it was him. Another, around the same time, a father and his teenage son, as well as another man, were squirrel hunting by 3 Mile Creek near Fairfax. While the men were getting a drink of water from a creek, the boy spotted a squirrel and pulled the trigger. The boy watched the squirrel tumble over the edge of the ravine. He chased it, and making his way down a steep wood slope into a gulch where the air was thicker and he could hear the murmuring of the creek. He found the squirrel and picked it up. Then he screamed, "Oh, Pa!" But by the time his father reached him, the boy had crawled onto a rock. He gestured toward the mossy edge of the creek and said, "A dead person." It was the body of what appeared to be an American Indian woman. She was on her back with her hair twisted in the mud. The men and the boy hurried out of the ravine and raced on their horse-drawn wagon through the prairie, dust swirling around them. When they reached Fairfax Main Street, they couldn't find any lawman, so they stopped at the Big Hill Trading Company, a large general store that had an undertaking business as well. They told the owner, Scott Mathis, of what had happened. He alerted his undertaker, who went with several men to the creek. There they recovered the body and then laid it inside the wooden box in the shade of the blackjack tree. The undertaker tried to determine if the woman was Anna Brown, whom he'd known, but he and the other men couldn't make an identification. Mathis, who had managed Anna's finances, contacted Molly, and she led the grim procession toward the creek, which included Ernest, Brian, Molly's sister Rita, and Rita's husband, Bill Smith. Many who knew Anna followed them, along with the curious. Vultures circled in the sky as Molly and Rita stepped close to the body. The sisters recognized Anna's blanket and the clothes that Molly had washed for her. Rita began to weep, and her husband led her away. Molly, trying to stay composed, mouthed the words, "Yes, it was Anna." Molly eventually retreated from the creek with Ernest, leaving behind the first hint of the darkness that threatened to destroy not only her family, but her tribe.